In the glittering age of ancient Rome, the marble arches, aqueducts, and golden palaces told a story of triumph. Senators debated beneath frescoed ceilings, legions returned in victory processions, and poets sang of Rome's eternal destiny. To later generations, Rome has often appeared as the beacon of civilization, the birthplace of law, architecture, and empire. But behind those marble columns was another Rome, a world rarely remembered in the grand sweep of history. It was a world hidden in private chambers, a Rome where power and luxury were purchased at the cost of human lives. And among the most tragic figures of this forgotten story were the young men forced into lives as concubines, bodies owned, beauty consumed, dignity erased. Their existence is almost absent from the triumphant histories written by Rome's elite. Yet, without them, the empire's culture of power and indulgence cannot be fully understood. This is not a story of military conquest or of emperors commanding armies across continents. This is the story of silence, of boys taken from their homes, thrust into roles they never chose, and made into ornaments of Rome's wealth. They were not merely servants. They were living possessions, selected for their youth, vulnerability, and physical allure, then kept as playthings for the empire's most powerful men. Roman society's understanding of intimacy and power was unlike our own. Where today we draw boundaries between consent and coercion, the Romans saw a hierarchy in which the weak existed to serve the strong. To be conquered, to be enslaved, to be stripped of choice, these were not tragedies in their eyes, but the natural order of the world. Within this order, male concubines represented the lowest rung of an already brutal hierarchy, denied even the protections afforded to ordinary slaves. Many of these boys were captured in war. Rome's hunger for conquest filled its slave markets with the young and defenseless children from Greece, Gaul, Asia Minor, and the Germanic forests. Others were born into bondage, their fate sealed from birth. Still others were sold by desperate families crushed under debt, their youth exchanged for survival. Whatever their origin, their path ended in the same place, the Roman slave market, where lives were bought and sold like cattle. The markets themselves were spectacles of cruelty. Imagine a square in the heart of a Roman town, the air heavy with incense and dust, as men of wealth strolled among rows of trembling bodies. The boys stood exposed, examined like livestock. Skin was pinched, teeth inspected, muscles prodded. Traders boasted of a youth's Greek refinement, his fair Germanic complexion, or the sturdiness of his frame, each detail advertised like a feature of fine merchandise. The buyers bargained loudly, but the boys had no voices in the matter. For Romans, this process was ordinary, as familiar as buying grain or livestock. For the young men, it was the moment their identity shattered. Stripped of family, stripped of homeland, they were now reduced to property. The cruel irony was that their beauty, which might have been a blessing in another life, was here the very reason for their captivity. Once purchased, their world narrowed further. To enter a Roman household as a concubine was to lose even the fragile independence of other slaves. They were expected to be available at every hour, summoned without warning, and to anticipate the whims of their masters before they were spoken. Resistance was dangerous, compliance no guarantee of safety. Smiles had to be forced, gratitude performed, dignity surrendered. Behind the silk robes and golden jewelry they were sometimes given, these young men lived in chains, invisible but unbreakable. Rome prided itself on law, order, and civilization. Yet here was a system where no law could shield its victims, no tradition could protect them, and no justice could be sought. For these concubines, the empire's proud legal codes were written only to ensure their silence. They lived in the shadows of marble palaces, carrying stories that the historians of the age never cared to record. This hidden Rome unsettles the image we inherit. The empire that raised aqueducts and amphitheaters also constructed a darker architecture, one built not of stone, but of human suffering. And at the foundation of that structure were the concubines, whose lives remind us that the glory of Rome was not shared equally. If the slave market was the threshold, the household was the prison. From the moment a concubine crossed the doorway of a wealthy Roman home, his life ceased to be his own. He belonged not to himself, but to the master who had purchased him, body and soul. Life for these young men was defined by uncertainty. Each day carried the same tension, the fear of being summoned, the pressure of pleasing a master whose whims could shift like the winds. 1 hour might bring a soft word, a token of favor, perhaps even a gift of fine clothing or jewelry. The next might bring anger, punishment, or cruel indifference. To survive, meant learning to read every glance, every gesture, and to perform gratitude, even in the face of humiliation. And yet, on the surface, some concubines seemed to live lives of privilege. They were often housed in luxurious quarters, dressed in silks, and adorned with ornaments that marked them as possessions of high value. Some were even granted access to education, taught to read poetry, quote philosophers, or debate politics. But these were not gifts, they were investments. Masters wanted companions who could amuse, flatter, and entertain them, companions who could speak intelligently at dinner parties or recite verses at a banquet. The education of a concubine was a leash disguised as refinement, every word of Cicero or Virgil serving only to heighten his master's pleasure. Others lived in far harsher conditions. In less wealthy homes, or in cases where a master grew bored, concubines were little better than common slaves. They were called upon only when desired, then dismissed back to cramped quarters stripped of privacy and possessions. For them, there was no illusion of luxury, only the bare fact of ownership. But perhaps the cruelest chains were not physical. Masters understood that fear alone was not enough. To control completely, they needed to shape the mind. Many concubines were isolated from other household members, forbidden to form friendships or alliances. They were shown moments of kindness, only to have them abruptly withdrawn, a calculated game that bred dependency and confusion. Over time, the concubine no longer knew whether he was favored or condemned. He lived suspended in anxiety, desperate to avoid displeasure, yet never certain what might trigger it. Where there were multiple concubines in a single household, another layer of cruelty emerged: competition. Masters often played favorites, granting small privileges to one while withholding them from another, setting the young men against each other. Any solidarity that might have eased their suffering was shattered by jealousy and fear. Instead of brothers in misfortune, they became rivals for survival. The burden of performance weighed heavily. Concubines were expected to appear cheerful, obedient, even affectionate, regardless of their inner despair. Imagine the act: to smile at the hand that enslaves you, to whisper gratitude while your dignity is stripped away. Over time, this constant performance blurred the line between survival and identity. Some concubines became consummate actors, molding themselves into whatever figure their master desired: the witty companion, the gentle listener, the obedient servant. But beneath the mask, their true selves withered. Roman culture itself fed into this cruelty. Beauty, youth, and strength were prized above all else. To the elite, possessing a concubine of exquisite appearance was not only personal indulgence but also a mark of prestige. Just as they displayed fine art, exotic animals, or rare wines, so too did they display their human possessions. The concubine was a living ornament, his value tied not to his spirit, but to how well he reflected his master's wealth and power. And yet, despite this bleakness, some found ways to endure. They developed subtle languages with other servants, passing warnings through glances and gestures. They learned to anticipate moods, to navigate the shifting tides of favor, to grasp at the smallest fragments of control in a life designed to strip them of it. For many, these small acts of adaptation were the difference between survival and ruin. To step inside the life of a male concubine, then, is to enter a world of contradictions, silks draped over chains, learning offered only as another form of bondage, smiles masking despair. It is a life that forces us to confront the unsettling truth that Rome's grandeur was built not only on triumphs of engineering or law, but on the systematic breaking of human will within the walls of its most opulent homes. To understand the life of a male concubine in Rome, we must look beyond the household and see the larger system that sustained it, a machinery of control designed to turn free human beings into obedient ornaments of luxury. This system was vast, calculated, and shockingly efficient. Some concubines were not simply plucked from markets. They were trained, much like gladiators were prepared for the arena. Across the empire, institutions existed where boys were conditioned for their future roles. Here, they learned not just how to walk, speak, or serve, but how to please. They were drilled in conversation, taught poetry and music, and trained to present themselves in ways that would appeal to wealthy buyers. To the Romans, this was an investment in value. To the boys, it was the slow dismantling of their individuality. Their bodies were sculpted according to their master's ideals. Physical training regimens, forced exercise, strict diets, and grooming rituals ensured they remained youthful and attractive. In some cases, their appearance was altered by crude medical procedures. Cosmetics were applied, hairstyled or removed, and sometimes even surgeries performed to reshape their features. These were not acts of care but of possession, bodies treated as clay to be molded at will no matter the pain. Even the clothes they wore carried meaning. A concubine might be draped in silks, adorned with gold bracelets, or perfumed with rare oils. But these luxuries were not signs of respect. They were symbols of ownership. Every jewel, every garment, every carefully arranged curl in their hair proclaimed not their status, but their master's power and wealth. They were living trophies, displayed to guests like works of art. Travel, too, became part of this system of control. A concubine might accompany his master from Rome to villas in Campania, to banquets in Alexandria, or to estates along the coasts of Gaul. To outsiders, this could appear as privilege, the chance to see the empire's wonders, but for the concubine, it was nothing more than captivity on the move. He had no choice in the matter, no say in where he went, and no reprieve from his obligations. Whether in a marble atrium or on a ship crossing the Mediterranean, he was expected to perform his role without question. Medical attention was offered, but not for his well-being. Masters invested in their concubines, the way they might care for a prized horse or hunting dog. If a boy fell ill, physicians were summoned not out of compassion but to preserve the value of property. Healing was measured in terms of appearance and function, not comfort or dignity. The body was maintained so long as it remained useful. The mind and spirit were of no concern. The Roman calendar itself reinforced this system. During great festivals, Saturnalia, Bacchanalia, or imperial celebrations, concubines were often forced into elaborate entertainments. They might sing, dance, or recite poetry, their beauty paraded as part of the spectacle. These festivals, joyous for others, became for concubines moments of heightened vulnerability, when their masters demanded they shine brightest under the eyes of strangers. In quieter months, they lived with the dread of the next summons, the next performance. Underlying all of this was an intricate psychology of domination. By granting small privileges, a jewel, a smile, a word of praise, and then withdrawing them, masters created dependency. By isolating concubines from one another, they prevented bonds of solidarity. By pitting them against rivals, they sowed jealousy and mistrust. These were not accidental cruelties, but deliberate methods of control honed over generations, ensuring that obedience was not just demanded but ingrained. What emerges from this picture is a chilling irony. Rome, the empire that celebrated its philosophy, its law, and its order, perfected a system of human manipulation so complete that it turned boys into objects without a voice. They were educated not to think freely but to entertain, dressed not to express themselves but to impress others, healed not to live fully but to endure longer as possessions. The machinery of control worked with brutal efficiency, but within its gears, fragile human lives endured, each carrying dreams and fears that could never be spoken aloud. In the empire's endless pursuit of power and pleasure, the concubine became both symbol and sacrifice, a silent testimony to how far Rome was willing to go in its quest to dominate not just nations, but the very bodies and spirits of the most vulnerable. The story of Rome's male concubines cannot be told without considering those left behind. For every boy dragged into slavery, there was a family, a village, a community that felt the wound. Some were taken by force, seized as spoils of war. The Roman legions, after burning towns and enslaving populations, did not merely claim land and wealth, they claimed people. The most vulnerable were marched in chains to distant markets, vanishing from the lives of their kin forever. Parents might spend years wondering what had become of their sons, whether they lived or died, never knowing they were trapped behind the polished walls of a Roman villa, reduced to property and silence. Others were victims of debt slavery, their fate sealed not by conquest but by desperation. A father crushed beneath taxes or crop failure might face an impossible choice: to surrender one son so that the rest of his children could survive. Imagine the agony of such a bargain, the knowledge that your child's body was the currency of your family's survival. For the boy, the knowledge was worse, that he had been both sacrificed and abandoned, even if out of love. The anguish of these families echoes across cultures where kinship was sacred. In many provincial societies, Celtic, Germanic, Greek, the family was not just blood but survival, the anchor of identity and community. To lose a son in this way was not merely personal grief but the tearing of the social fabric itself. Entire communities bore the scars of Rome's hunger for human adornment. For the concubines themselves, resistance was both a dream and a death sentence. Some attempted to escape, driven by desperation strong enough to risk everything. But Rome was a world where fugitives were hunted, and a concubine caught in flight was punished with cruelty designed to make an example of him. Whippings, brandings, public humiliation, all reminders that their bodies did not belong to themselves. The rare concubine who slipped away into freedom did so at enormous risk, often forced to abandon his identity entirely, to disappear as someone new. Others sought escape in darker ways. Some tried to end their suffering through suicide, but even here, their master's control extended over them. Valuable property could not be lost so easily. Masters placed them under constant supervision, removing sharp tools or cords, ensuring even death was denied without permission. The cage of the concubine was not just physical, but existential. Life and death alike held in the grip of another. Religion, too, offered little comfort. Roman gods were worshipped as protectors of justice, family, and fortune, yet those divine promises seemed to skip over the concubine. The rituals of the household were for the master, not for the owned. Some concubines may have turned to foreign cults, the mystery religions of Isis, Mithras, or Dionysus, where secrecy and ritual offered glimpses of belonging. In the dark of hidden ceremonies, perhaps they found a sliver of identity not defined by chains. Yet even this was dangerous. Discovery could mean punishment, for a concubine's spirit was not his own to guide. Still, amid despair, sparks of humanity remained. Some concubines forged secret connections with others in the household. A shared glance, a whispered word, a coded gesture passed in the corridor. These fragile networks of empathy were lifelines, a reminder that they were not entirely alone. In households with multiple concubines, rivalry was the rule, but sometimes solidarity bloomed in defiance of cruelty. The smallest acts a warning about a master's mood. A moment of comfort after punishment became rebellions of compassion. The broader consequences of this system stretched far beyond individuals. By normalizing the ownership of young men as objects of pleasure, Roman society entrenched cruelty into its very culture. To the elite, there was no contradiction between discussing stoic virtue in the Senate and owning a concubine in private. This dissonance between lofty ideals and lived exploitation revealed the moral fracture at the heart of Rome. And yet, even in the bleakest accounts, there are glimmers of resilience. Resistance could take many forms. The concubine who learned to anticipate moods so well that he carved out small freedoms. The boy who carried his cultural songs and stories in his memory as a secret act of preservation. The one who survived long enough to one day walk free. These were victories not celebrated in marble or bronze, but in the stubborn survival of spirit against a system designed to crush it. Rome may have broken their bodies, silenced their voices, and erased their names. But in the unrecorded corners of history, their resistance lived in whispers, in survival, in the quiet defiance of refusing to surrender one's humanity entirely. What became of these young men when time, inevitably, stripped away the beauty that had once marked them as valuable? The answer is, as grim as their lives. For most, there was no escape, no path to freedom. Unlike other slaves who might one day purchase manumission or earn release, concubines rarely had such chances. Their usefulness to their masters was tied to youth and appearance, and when that faded they were often cast aside like broken objects. Some were sold to lower households where conditions were harsher and status even lower. Others were abandoned entirely, left with no skills to survive beyond the narrow roles they had been forced to play. A rare few, by luck or cunning, managed to reinvent themselves, hiding their past to carve out new lives. But their successes only underline the rule that most concubines were consumed by the system and forgotten as soon as they no longer pleased. The silence surrounding their existence in Roman records is telling. Historians of the time, writing of battles and emperors, rarely mentioned concubines except in euphemisms. When they appear, it is in half sentences, as if their suffering was too trivial to record. Archaeology offers only fleeting glimpses, objects that hint at grooming rituals, fragments of jewelry that once marked ownership, walls that may have enclosed their quarters. Their voices are absent, not because they had nothing to say, but because no one allowed them to be heard. And yet, if we read between the lines of Rome's cultural memory, the truth emerges. The poets who praised beauty, the satirists who mocked extravagance, the philosophers who debated power all wrote in a world where concubines existed in plain sight. Their silence was not ignorance but complicity. Rome's grandeur rested on exploitation, and its elite preferred not to dwell on the cost. What lessons, then, do we draw? First, that civilizations can build magnificent legacies while ignoring unimaginable cruelty. Rome perfected law, order, and architecture, but it also perfected dehumanization. To speak of the Colosseum without speaking of the lives it consumed, to speak of Roman virtue without acknowledging the concubines' chains, is to accept only half the truth. Second, that the normalization of cruelty is one of history's most dangerous forces. The Romans saw nothing unusual in buying boys for pleasure, just as they saw nothing unusual in watching men slaughter each other for sport. Cruelty, when dressed in ritual and tradition, becomes invisible. This lesson remains urgent today, reminding us to question the systems we accept, to ask who pays the hidden cost of our prosperity, and finally, that even in the darkest conditions, the human spirit resists erasure. The concubines of Rome, nameless as most remain, endured with a stubborn will to survive. Some resisted openly, some silently endured, some carried fragments of culture and identity within them as acts of defiance. Their resilience is a reminder that humanity persists, even when stripped of freedom. We may never know their names, never hear their voices directly, but in remembering them, in bringing their stories out of the shadows, we honor their existence. They were not ornaments of luxury, not disposable bodies. They were human beings with dreams, fears, and dignity that Rome sought to deny. The horrific life of a male concubine in the Roman Empire is not a footnote in history. It is a mirror held to civilization itself, asking us how far societies will go to protect privilege and at what human cost. Rome's marble temples still stand, but so too does the memory of those whose suffering built them. Their silence challenges us to listen more carefully, to see more honestly, and to ensure that exploitation, once normalized, is never accepted again. In the end, their legacy is not only a warning but a call to conscience, to recognize the vulnerable in our own world, and to refuse the silence that allowed their suffering to be forgotten for 2,000 years.